Well, I welcome everybody in this series that we're going to do. And as I said in the newsletter, I'm not quite sure how many will be in the series, but there's quite a number of topics I want to cover. And one of these topics, when we get to the end, and this is especially for Derek, will be on the cold weather in the winter, how you're going to deal with a cold house. Different options that you have, but it'll also include the foam clothing and the sleeping pod, and then we'll be able to move into the further construction on the clothing that's so important for you to do. But anyway, grid down series, part one, base cause effects. And if that's not clear to you in the newsletter, I tried to explain it without spending a lot of time, but it's really important that you understand what caused the loss of the power grid, because that'll make a real difference in what you may decide to do and why you do it. Now, when we're talking about this nasty subject here, this really could be a gloom and doom kind of a topic. You know, my truth about life is there's just no doubt tomorrow will come and things happen, but how you're prepared to meet tomorrow will make all the difference in the world. If you're prepared for the worst, then no matter what happens, there'll be an adventure. So we're going to look at some of the worst case scenarios because if you're thinking about them, preparing for them, you'll be further ahead than other people. And of course, my mission is just to reach and teach in every way that I can, and I want to do that and be able to publish these things so they're available to people. On this topic, on the loss of power grid, I've published these two of these classes that I would encourage you to go watch and ponder them. The easiest way to find them on YouTube. They're also on my website, but easy way to find them for most people or to send other people to them. Just go to my website, jimsway.com, find the YouTube link on there, click on that, and then you can get into my channel in there. Look for the worst risk you face. It's split into two parts, and also why the loss of power grid is the worst thing that can happen to us as a society, as a group. So very important you watch those. But as I said in the newsletter, if you haven't done this, this is published on Vimeo. Grid Down Power Up. Please watch that because they had the bucks, if you will. I don't know. They probably spent a few $1,000,000 to produce that thing, and they did a good job. They covered all the things that I talk about, except the things we're going to go forward with now. They don't discuss them. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. But if you want to help yourself understand that this is real, this is on the horizon, then you need to watch that and get other people to watch it because it's well produced, has good graphics, good interviews, and things like that. All the people that I've been listening to and reading about that are truly experts in this, they're in there. So listen to them, send people there, and do the one thing that they do suggest that we do. But I'm going to have a comment on that at the end because although that's important, they really missed the boat in that. But again, their purpose is to get people to action to understand this. Now, what's the probability of this occurring in our current generation? Now, you can, decide what current generation is. I'll say even in my generation, as an old guy who's 76 years old, in my generation, in my children's, my grandchildren's generations, what's the probability of this occurring? Well, as I make a point in there, it's 99.99%. And I run those 99s out there quite a ways because it's so close to 100% that it might as well be that. Well, and I'm not here to convince you of that. Watch the videos, watch what I've said, what other people say, and then say, okay, what do I need to do? Now, in the video on loss of power grid and others that I've done, I talk about the need to have some practical, realistic, and affordable answers to these 6 considerations. Grid down, that's the topic. What's the base cause? That's tonight's discussion. We're talking about what climate you're in. Is it summer? Is it winter? Are you rural? Are you city? Because each one of those will have an effect on it. Well, tonight, base cause is what we're going to be discussing because this is really important. Don't blow this off and say, well, I understand the power grid's going to go away sometime, and yeah, when it does. No, this is serious. You need to understand this, and you also want to know why. Analyze as best you can when the power's off, when it's been off for hours, days, and or you look around and see what's going on. You can start to analyze and say, oh, it really is off. So one of the things that we want people to understand just a little bit, because I've done some classes on this, what's the power grid? Take a look at a space shot up here, looking at the U.S. at night. All of the electrification that has occurred around this country. It's wonderful. It gives us our lifestyle. It's a very complex system. And you take a look at these regional power control rooms in these things. They look just like when I was a reactor operator instructor. Well, we didn't have all the digital stuff, so it didn't look that good. But all these panels and switches and lights and looking at things and the logs that you're keeping, of course, they log them in the computers now. We just had to do it on paper and graph things on paper. That's long ago when I was doing that in the 70s. But these power grids, we have three major regions of power grids in the U.S. and interconnects within them. Even our little city here at Spring City, we have our own generating system. It doesn't supply all the power. We're connected to the power grid, and there's other cities around here that do the same. And so there's these interconnections that are important to understand, and they bring us this wonderful lifestyle that we have. But we also need to understand that we have an extreme dependence on the infrastructure and services for our well-being that's really brought to us by our power grid. And you take a look at all this infrastructure grids, not just the power grid, but the rail and pipeline and trucking and air traffic and ocean going, and then the communications that are all contained within these things, the print and internet, broadcast, microwave, landlines, fiber optic, satellite links, up and down links of all kinds of things. And you can go online and take a look at all these networks of these things out there for the different kinds of pipelines, different rail systems, the air traffic, all these kinds of things. It's fascinating, it's amazing, it's wonderful, but it also makes it tenuous. And one of the things that you need to understand as we go through this is why does it take so long to recover from some of these things? Hey, it's just turn it back on if it gets turned on. Just flip the switches, go fix something, what have you. Well, start taking a look at this. And again, we have this extreme dependence on our power grid to make all of the other utilities and services available. Power, the electric power grid brings everything to us. I've made that point in other classes. And one of the problems we have is with the loss of the power grid, it takes down all of the other utilities and services. And this is nearly impossible for us to really wrap our heads around, our collective heads, our societal heads around these things, to say, how could it be? Particularly in generations that are living right now, because, well, we've always had power. And yeah, it goes out sometimes for a few hours, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks when they have some of these major incidents with tornadoes and hurricanes that occur. Even the Texas thing that was down there was out for a few days. But then it comes back because there's all this work to bring it back. But when we talk about some of the damage that can occur from the loss of the power grid through some of these ways that it will occur, you have to start taking a look at what does it take if equipment is damaged to get it back up and running. Well, some of these transformers, they're gigantic. They're huge. They're very difficult to move, very expensive to use. And one of the problems that we have is when many of these things were put in 40 and 50 years ago, some of these gigantic things, we had a bigger rail service than we did right now. Many of them were moved by rail to those locations. Well, those rail lines don't exist. Yes, they can be moved by trucks, and that's a major undertaking to move them around. I have other pictures of these things, but we're not going to spend too much time there. Just understand these things are gigantic. They're huge. And the other problem is not only are they big, hard to move, they're very expensive, costing millions and tens of $1 million in some cases. And we don't make very many in this country anymore. Less than 5% the last time I looked is made in this country. We import them from all over the world. Canada, China, Australia, and as a matter of fact, and this chart's a little bit older because more come from China than is shown on here. We import them from overseas. They have to be custom built for the site that they're going to. These are not stocked on the shelf. You put in an order, they build it for you, you make your payments on it, and then 18 to 24 months later, you're going to get them, and then they'll show up on a ship, a barge, and then you're going to figure out how to move it in. This takes years in some cases to replace them, 1, 2, maybe even 3 years with some of the problems that you may have. So that's the difficulty, one of the difficulties, because it takes a lot of work and expense to bring them. And I go into that deeper in another course here. I just want you to understand this is not go down to, down to the Home Depot and pick up some electrical components. Some of these things are huge, and the way that the damage can come in them, it does damage, it destroys them. These are from some of the geomagnetic storms that occurred, and there's a geomagnetic induced current flow within them that is huge, monstrous. It's big enough that it melts them down. It does damage internally in there, and they have to be rebuilt from the ground up in some cases, parts of them done. So you take a look at it, and these are pictures of some of these things that occurred in the past and some of the things that we'll talk about. When you damage those things, now you're back to getting them from overseas and bringing them in. Of course, you have to understand when our power system is down, our transportation is down, our communications is down, our energy and fuel infrastructure is down. So you got to start everything up. That's why when it's big and it's really shut down in a major way, it's going to take decades to bring it back up for some of these things. Now, hopefully that won't occur where it'd be that bad, but even if it's just a smaller thing that occurs or a very localized thing that occurs, it can put a lot of stress on the system. So you take a look at the damage from these gigantic copper coils and wires inside that have been overheated and damaged. And again, I'll talk more about that in another class. I just want you to understand this is a big deal. Okay, causes of power grid loss. Well, this has been discussed for quite a while, and there's a lot out there. There's reports that have been written for years on this and the potential of it. And some of them have escalated these stories to say, hey, we're at risk. Of course, some people say, well, we've been talking about this since, the 70s and 80s and what have you. It hasn't happened yet. Therefore, it can't happen. Well, think again is what it comes down to. Now then, some of these reports, they've been done, like 60 Minutes did this, that the U.S. is at risk of national blackouts from small scale attacks. It doesn't have to be the major things we talk about. It could be small scale, just multiple ones of that. So I'll talk a little bit about that, these different ways that we lose the power grid. Now, I've identified 5 indirect causes of power grid loss that don't, not directly onto the power grid where you're attacking it, but indirectly. Well, you take a look at those 5, and they include this: overlapping natural disasters, big ones here, and multiple ones that do damage. Famine, how can that do it? Well, if you have major famine going on, you get a lot of, civil unrest and anarchy, and people get unhappy and they want to shoot something up. Economic collapse, downturn, those things, war, invasion, all those things start to link together. They pile up on top of each other. People don't go to work. There isn't money to repair things. And if you don't show up to keep the equipment running, then it starts to fail. Trickle down effects in it. But let's go to the direct attacks. There are 5 direct causes of power grid loss, and this is what I'll talk about this evening: operational failure, physical attack, cyber attack, GME, CME, GME, and HEMP. Okay, we'll go through these one at a time. Now, I actually, because of things that are going, I actually only had from 1 o'clock today until 6:30 this evening to put this together. So there are some things that are not harmonized. I don't have pictures on everything. It's going to be a little more discussion than I like to do, but I committed to do this and I want to get started on it. I'll come back and redo this class or add some of the pictures and images in here and clean it up when I do, the backside editing. So what do I mean by this operational failure? Well, we have a recent operational failure that was a big deal 2 years ago down in Texas. And one of the reports that came out of that, they were 4 minutes and 37 seconds from destroying major parts of the power grid. What this is, they were trying to provide enough power to all these things where the electric power was being drawn on very heavy for heaters and for fans and those kinds of things to keep these people warm because of this extreme cold in there. It was starting to press the equipment to the limits, and they were pushing it for as hard as it would go. And if they let it go as far as it would go, then you actually start damaging some of the generating equipment. And here again, you're now months and years for repairs. And so they had to make a decision for a controlled shutdown. There's a lot of automatic things in there, but they were, if you will, kind of holding the breaker shut for a while, trying to supply to people because, that's their job. They're a utility, but it was just being pressed too hard. And so they had to go through an operational control shutdown of sections in there to protect the equipment. Now, not everybody was out without power. There were some areas that still had some limited power or they had the rolling brownouts and blackouts. There were other areas that didn't get power back for quite a while. But during that time, there were deaths that occurred. Now, there's some conflicting numbers on that. When I looked at some of the numbers on that, there were some 750 people that died due to direct causes from the loss of the power grid, and they didn't have heat and things like that. There were thousands of injuries that occurred. There was certainly lots of suffering. So it ranged from some 250 deaths that they can attribute to it, like 750 deaths. Well, any one of those deaths was catastrophic to that family, to that individual, all because we lost power when people needed it and they weren't prepared to deal with that. Well, I want you to be prepared to deal with the loss of power grid, whether it's short or whether it's long term. Another operational one, and we have actually quite a few examples of this, but I'm just going to give you a few of them. This is the one that occurred August 14, 2003. This was the blackout in New York and in New England in there. A satellite picture from space to show where it's all now dark in there. And this was now this was in the summer. This wasn't cold. This was the other end of the season there. And what it was, when the air conditioning and the fans are being run really, really hard when it's really hot, you have the power lines are hot just because the temperatures are hot, and then there's a lot of current flowing through them, and they expand and they sag. And in this case, there was tree limbs that sagged on some branches, and then there were some bugs in the system, so that the shutdowns that were supposed to go on to protect the equipment, more and more of them shut down. It triggered things offline, and so we lost power for a while. Some places it was days, 4 days. Other places it wasn't quite that long. It affected 508 generating units, 256 power plants, 22 nuclear reactors, and there were at least 11 deaths directly attributed to that. And when you take a look at what it looked like going across the one of the bridges there in New York City, and all the elevators are shut down, the subways are shut down, the traffic is shut down, and so people are walking home in the heat. Well, that was pretty unpleasant. Also, there's a lot of chances when that occurs, when the power's off for very long. There's a lot of, well, you know how when you flip off the lights, or you flip the lights back on, and the cockroaches run for under the shelves and things like that. Well, when the lights are out, the cockroaches come out. And there's some real cockroaches in our society, and that's a problem. So these power lines that are to be maintained in the trees, that's why you see all this tree trimming going on out there. There's some pictures. Well, fires have been started by tree limbs getting on the power lines, whether the power line sagged, was swung over to it, fell on them, or the tree branches fell on them, or it was weighted down with ice. It can start some fires, and it can cause damage all around us in there. That's an operational problem where the maintenance wasn't being kept up with the vines and trees, and or there was a bug in a system that the automatic protection didn't work quite right, and it caused a shutdown across a larger area. So that's a problem. Now, what are the consequences and the effects of that and the full-time recovery? Well, if it's an operational thing like that and it's just one area, you see this region where it was in there, and after, a few hours, a few days, they're able to start routing around the problem, bringing in power. That's the advantage of having a grid, because if one generating unit is offline, or one substation has been damaged, and or some switch gear has been hurt, if you can route power around it, and there's enough excess generating and distribution capability in other areas, then they can bring it back in. So it may not be, all over. However, if you think about that, if we had that kind of a thing occur in 3 or 4 or 5 regions of this country, whether it be in the winter or in the extreme heat of the summer, and it starts shutting things down, and then if you try to push the system too hard, as they were doing down in Texas to keep it going, they were within 4 minutes, 37 seconds of doing serious damage to equipment that would have greatly extended the shutdown period. But the point about this is that if you have this kind of of effect, full recovery is not likely to take very long. Maybe in a regional area, like when we have Hurricane Sandy, or we have a Katrina, some of those things. In some cases, it was months to bring power back, but other areas came in within a few days. So you don't have to worry too much about that unless you're right where it's going to be off for a week or a month or longer. You'd like to know that, and you'd like to be prepared to deal with it. So taking a look at what your risks are will help you say, I need to be prepared to be without power for a week or 2 weeks or a month or what have you. and then make preparations to do it and don't get all freaked out about it happening. Okay, then we have another one, number two of this, physical attacks. Now, this is actually going on all the time. And if you watch that video that I referred you to, Grid Down, Power Up, and they give some statistics in there about the number of attacks that are going on. And most of these are kind of malicious. They're kind of like, okay, the good old boys had a kegger. They got all excited about things. And now they're complaining about something and they decide to go shoot something and see if it, throws off any sparks. That does occur. Disgruntled employees, different things like that. But then we have things that get a little more serious. Now, when you take a look at these power grids, and you have to understand that the power grid, when it was being built, when we were starting to electrify this country, it started out in the cities and then it moved more out into rural. And when it was being built, it was being put together for the ease of access, for convenience, for engineering efficiency, keep the price down. There was no thought in mind about terrorist attacks or threats to it because, well, that wasn't occurring that much back then, years ago. Now it's occurring all the time. Go take a look at that video, Grid Down, Power Up, and you'll see a little bit more there. And you can do your own research because, boy, there's a lot of things out there on this, the attacks that are going on. This is one I've mentioned before, and they talk about this is the 2013 attack at the Metcalf power transmission substation. They're one of these giant ones. These are the giant ones that if you break them and you break several of them, it affects the whole power grid. That's an interesting one to look at. And there were some people that have said some conclusions, well, it wasn't a terrorist attack. The other analysts, when you look at them, say, no, it was planned. It was orchestrated. This was not some good old boy shooting up some transformers. These were people that knew where to cut the underground communications, when to cut it, so that the communications would be off, so they would have time enough to get in, do the damage, and get away before the police showed up. Now, again, this was not a major problem for very long because it was just one isolated station, and they were able to route power around it after a few hours, and power was coming back online while they did the repairs. If I remember right, I think there was $13 million in damage that had to be repaired to that place. Well, that goes into your power bill, by the way, and raises the cost to everybody. When we take a look across this country and we think of these, what if there was multiple coordinated physical attacks? Because it is an attack. In the U.S., there are more than 25,000 power substations with voltage ratings over 34 kV, 34,000 volts or above. Some of them are much higher than that. So there's a whole bunch of them out there. And then you consider, well, there's more than 2,100 power substations with voltage ratings of 35,000 volts and above, like Metcalf. That was one of those things there. And you understand that if you do damage to these things, they're huge, they're expensive, they're hard to get. They may take months and years to get them back. They don't have them sitting around on the shelf, to just plug them back in. And it's going to take a while to bring the power grid back. So a coordinated attack on 6 to 9 of these that shuts them down can bring down the whole power grid. And the problem is, during the process of the shutdown, if things don't work just right, not only will you do damage that's been, shot into those or however it's been done, how they've been blown up or damaged. Now there's other equipment that will be damaged. So it kind of cascades. It gets worse and worse. One of the reports that said in there on this country's electric transmission substations, these are the big ones, just knock out 9 of them, and we have a coast-to-coast blackout. How long it will last? Well, this is going to be a little longer. Will all the power be off to everybody? No, probably will not be. But it will be coast to coast of these blackouts. There'll be isolated places where there's still power that's going on. Good if you're in that location. But in some of the other places, it may be months or a year or two before you're going to get reliable power back. Now, you may have rolling blackouts and brownouts and those things, but you won't have the power grid the way you have it now. That's what you need to understand. And you need to be prepared to deal with that. So as you take a look at and you want to analyze, why is the power off? You're listening to, if you still have power around that, you have internet, you have radio, you have shortwave or what have you, you're going to be listening to what's going on out there with a skeptical ear to things, because there'll be all kinds of rumors floating around on things. You're going to have to listen to a whole bunch of stuff and filter through the junk and then decide, okay, this is not the big one, but this is bad. My power's off. It's not going to be everybody forever for the next years, but it's going to be a real problem and it'll be very expensive. So the effects and time to recovery, well, it'll depend on where you are, how big and how serious that is. Realizing that equipment, as I said, it may take months, years to get some of it replaced. So our power grid will not be as reliable. You may not be able to have power 24/7. You may have these rolling blackouts, brownouts that are occurring, and there'll be some areas that are, sorry folks, you just are not going to have power until we rebuild this system. So be prepared for that is what you want to do. And again, depending on where you are in your own analysis, you may say like, well, I'm at a bigger threat than some other places. Be ready to deal with it. Okay. Now we up the ante a little bit more. Cyber attack. A lot of discussion on this. Oh, lots of discussion out there. And this is both fascinating, but it's also like there's a bunch of people, organizations, individuals, groups, countries, state actors. They don't like us. We are in their way. They're not able to do what they would like to do because we still exist. We still have a strong military. Now, have we done everything right? Do we deserve some of the hatred? We do. We've made a lot of mistakes that if we hadn't done them, it would probably be better. We could maybe have more friends, but it is as it is. And you're just going to have to deal with it. So you take a look at that and some of these actors that are out there. And in particular, when you go through that video that I've referred you to, Grid Down Power Up, go through mine, but the Grid Down Power Up has a lot more in there. There are people that are inside of our systems, and it is known by I'll say the analysts and the people inside our government that there are people with their fingers on the button to kill our power grid. Now, one of the books I refer you to is Lights Out by Ted Koppel. I highly, highly recommend you get that book. By the way, it's on Audible. And I do have, I'll show you in a second here, there's an interview that was done with him that you can get through my website, that you can listen to an interview with Ted Koppel. You need to go through that book because we have some of these state actors out there that want to shut us down. Major report, cyber attacks put Russians' fingers on the switches of the power plants. And you'll see that in the analysts that are doing that. They know they're in there. Now, are our cyber people working to block that and to get in there and figure out where they have their finger on the button, if you will? And this is not just flip a switch and it turns it off. These are the kinds of cyber attacks. And by the way, have we done those things in this country? Yes, we did. The centrifuges that were enriching uranium to make the nuclear weapons. We were able to use it was, let's see, Stuxnet. I think maybe that was it. I don't remember. I know that's one of the attacks that was done. There's been several of them out there. But what they did was they were able to get into the SCADA control system. These are automatic controls that run these centrifuges that are kind of the brains of how they operate. And they caused them to run out of control out to higher speeds than they were intended to run at. Now, these things are turning at, I don't know, it's 130,000 RPM or something like that. Well, you run it up a little bit higher and they just tear themselves apart. So this is not about, oh, we're just going to turn it off and then we can go back in and flip a switch. No, we're talking about doing damage to generators, to have switches that don't open when they should open to save things, switches that close out of phase. Out of phase is one of those things where you have power generation when it gets out of phase. That does huge damage. It blows things up. These are things that are known about, have been practiced. And so you need to understand this is not just flip a switch, we turn it back on. And it is known that Russia is inside of our power grids, portions of it, inside of all of it. Don't know. Look, there's hundreds of thousands of these little control SCADAs and other things around there, these chips and controls. How do you get to all of them, find out what's there? And one of the problems that's been noted is that since China is now making a large portion of our control equipment, have they built in some back doors, maybe some switches, some systems that could be accessed? There's all kinds of things that could be done. Don't know. Now, here's that interview that I told you about. This was done by Radio West, which goes out of Salt Lake City, KUER. You can get there, but you can get to it by going to my website, into the jimsway.com, into the public library, go to clothing and then scroll down until you see this picture right here, and you can download there's a PDF file there where you can download the document that has the link so that you can go listen to that interview. I'd recommend that you do. It was a good interview, not as much as is in the book, but it'll give you an idea about how serious this is. And there's people that are well aware of these problems, and we're trying to fix it, but it's very complex. Okay, time to recovery. Well, that depends. It depends on how many points they were able to access. Did they just turn some things off? Did they get some out of phase signals in there so that now we've had equipment that has clashed and burned itself out? Is it just one or two transformers, substations, generating stations? Is it 20, 30, or 40 of them? So the effects can be very widespread, and the time to recovery could be extensive. And here again, it'll be kind of like the coordinated physical attacks. Will the power be off to everybody, every place? Probably not. In fact, in our little town right here, where we have our own generating system, they're not likely to attack it directly. Although, if they send in the right signals into the power lines and our protection systems here don't cut us off, then it could even do damage to our little hydropower plant up there. Probably won't. It's probably going to be okay. But then again, I can't guarantee that because we don't have protection specifically for that. So again, we could be in our city here, still have some power. Now, we don't generate enough power to run this whole city. We produce, I'm on the power board, so I understand these things, and I worked for the city. We generate about 1/3 of the power that we need to run this town. Well, if we turned off a lot of things like all the street lights, and you may not run your electric stove and or your electric heat and your electric dryers, now we've got enough power to run a lot of fans and things that would be really necessary to keep things going. But that's going to require some serious cooperation and some heartburn with a lot of people because there's things you can't run. And I've had discussions with that about in our city what we would do to turn off some parts of this power grid that we have internally and go to people and say, this is what you have to do if you want power. So we get things turned off and then we can bring it back so you can have lights, you can have some fans, and you can have some heat, not electric heat, but you'd have other, fans that run your furnaces and things like that so we could keep going. So it becomes a real challenge to bring up parts of the grid and keep some people being taken care of. Well, let's up the ante a little bit more. Number 4 out of 5, CME, GMS. CME, coronal mass ejection, GMS, geomagnetic storms. Now, what this is about, and this is the one that is 100% statistically accurate that this will happen in the future. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. That's one thing why I say it's going to happen. This could happen next week, 2 years from now. It might be 10 or 20 years from now, but it will occur because it has occurred. These super storms, these super solar storms like the Carrington event of 1859 that did extensive damage to our telegraph system. That was the only electrical thing we had battery operated. There were only a few thousand miles of antenna, all of those wires hanging out there in our power system, and the telegraph that we had back then. Those are antenna that pick up the GMS induced current into the lines in there that burned up equipment and set poles on fire, that set shacks on fire, that shocked a few people. Not aware of any deaths that occurred from electrocution because the voltage was low, but the current was very, very high. It's like those branches in the trees in the picture I showed earlier where they're burning. Well, that's what it did to the telegraph poles and the telegraph equipment out there. Now, this can occur again. There's warnings that have been about that. And this is a NASA science report about the solar superstorm of July 2012. We missed it by, if I remember right, by 2 weeks. It was the Earth was out of phase because, see, the sun, when it launches out one of these storms, it isn't like it goes out in every direction. It goes out in one area where there was a gigantic solar flare that launched out from space, and you have this thing pointed in a particular direction. If you just happen to be in the way of that sucker, it nailed you. That's what happened in 1859. Now, we've had lots of smaller ones. We had one here a couple of 3 weeks ago. There was a space weather warning, and there could be some disruption. I noticed during that period of time that the cell service was a little spotty. and it was a little more breaking up and things like that. The satellites get disrupted, and so it can occur. But if it's a giant one like Carrington out there, it just fries them, and it fries everything on the ground. This induced current fries the equipment. Now, we could actually be protected from that, and I will tell you that Russia recognizes the potential for this, and because they are state controlled, because see, we have space weather warnings, and if you see one of these things coming to the Earth, then what Russia has determined they'll do when they see it's going to be a big one, they just pull the plug. They just shut all the equipment down because they have control. They can do that, and you can't sue them. In this country, we don't do that. So far, it's kind of like, well, we'll just try and ride it out. We'll see if we can. It can burn up a lot of things, and this has occurred to other equipment. That's what's see what happened. Some of those transformer pictures that was damaged because they weren't shut down. We have warnings of the storms coming that are big enough to burn up the equipment. Pull the plug. Now the problem with that is there are people at home that are on oxygen concentrators, and you turn off the power to them, and some of those people die, and then they're going to be suing people because of health damages. You want to talk about this litigious society, there will be so many, this is what they're afraid of. There will be so many suits coming at them and they can't survive it. So it's kind of like, well, if we burn up the equipment, then we're innocent. We did our best, but we're innocent. Okay, well, I think we should think about things a little better than that. Scientific American warns about catastrophic solar superstorms because they do occur. So this is known. Effects and time to recovery could be beyond your lifetime and your children's lifetime when we're going to get power back. If it's the big one, the really, really big one, it destroys enough equipment. Now, will everybody be without power? No, there'll be some power that'll still run. Like I mentioned, even my little generating systems here and some others out there, they may still be working, but we can't power the grid off this little 25 kW hydro generating plant up here. It's 1/3 of what we need for this city. So there'll be places that'll still have some power. And of course, some individuals may do that if they protect it. Now, if you have your grid-tied solar system plugged into into the power grid, it's probably going to be fried along with the rest of the things. It may or may not be, depending on how all the equipment shuts down and things like that. But it might fry that equipment. And what it is, it's the antennas that are hanging out there that pick up this pulse of energy. This is sometimes called a natural EMP, is what we'll think about. Now, it doesn't have the E1 of an EMP, doesn't have the big, gigantic, very high voltage spike because it comes on slowly. But the current that comes, it's the equivalent of the E1 and E2 that comes with an EMP. The EMP is E1, 2, and 3. This is not the class on that. But the super solar storm is like E2 and 3 in particular. Time to recovery and effects could burn up a lot of equipment. It could be decades to getting power back the way it is right now. And the problem with that, again, is now we've lost our communication. Now our factories are down. Now our economy's been really destroyed. It could be generations for it to come back. We don't have what we had before. That's kind of a gloom and doom statement, people. But you have to figure this is reality. This is true. Could we protect ourselves? Absolutely. Now, that video I refer you to, which is telling you at the end, in particular, you should get involved with a few other million people demanding that we spend the money that it takes, have the political will and the money that it takes, because it's only a few tens of billions of dollars to protect most of it. Maybe all of it, maybe $100 billion. There's all kinds of numbers that float around on that. Hey, we're spending a lot more on that and some other things that we could maybe do without or reduce.